December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In the span of about 90 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy did something no power had ever done to the United States before. Crippled the strongest battle fleet in the Pacific, without losing a single major warship of its own. 8 American battleships sunk or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. Over 20,400 Americans dead. And the force that did it. 6 aircraft carriers, more than 400 planes, crews trained to a standard no other navy on Earth could match at that point in the war. Sailed home to Japan almost untouched. That was not luck. By late 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy was, by most honest measures, the most capable carrier force in the world. Its pilots averaged hundreds more flight hours than their American counterparts. Its long-lance torpedo, fired from surface ships, was faster, longer-ranged, and carried a bigger warhead than anything in the U.S. arsenal. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled a stretch of ocean and territory larger than the continental United States. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, half the Central Pacific, no navy in history had expanded its reach that fast. And yet, inside that same navy, in briefing rooms and pilot-ready rooms, on the very carriers that had just humiliated the U.S. fleet, a specific kind of dread was already taking shape. Not fear of American battleships, which the Japanese had just proven they could gut in a single morning, and not fear of American fighter planes, which their Zero pilots still outflew in early 1942. It was fear of a much slower, much clumsier-looking aircraft, the torpedo bomber, a plane so unglamorous that American pilots themselves sometimes called their own squadrons the Suicide Boys before a single shot was fired. Before we get to why. Because the reason is stranger and more human than you'd expect. I want to ask you something. This channel is building a real, ongoing record of what actually happened in the Pacific, from not the recycled highlight reel. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. Some of the best corrections and details on this channel have come directly from families of the men who were actually there. Now back to the story. Because 6 months after Pearl Harbor, that fear was about to be paid for in American blood. And it's the reason the Japanese Navy started respecting torpedo bombers in the first place. June 4, 1942. 7:02 hours. The waters northeast of Midway Atoll, 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8 launched off the deck of USS Hornet, led by 41-year-old Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. The Devastator was already obsolete by 1942. Slow, thinly armored, and forced to fly low and level on its final approach, which made it one of the easiest targets in the sky for a defending fighter. Waldron knew this. Before the squadron departed, he'd reportedly told his executive officer they were getting green pilots, and might not have much time to train them properly. They found the Japanese carrier strike force alone, with no fighter escort of their own. What followed lasted roughly 10 minutes. Japanese Zeros tore into the formation from above, while anti-aircraft fire from the escorting cruisers and destroyers filled the sky below. Every single one of VT-8's 15 Devastators was shot down. Of the 30 men who flew that morning, 29 were killed. The lone survivor, Ensign George Gay, watched the rest of the battle from a life raft, hidden under a seat cushion, close enough to see Japanese sailors on the decks of the carriers he'd just tried to kill. Minutes later, torpedo squadrons 6 and 3 attacked from Enterprise and Yorktown. The result was almost identical. Of 41 Devastators launched that morning across all 3 squadrons, only 6 returned. Not one torpedo hit its target. By any conventional measure of the action itself, fighting, it was one of the worst massacres in American naval aviation history. But here is the detail that Japanese commanders would spend the rest of the war trying to explain to their own superiors. Those 35 dead torpedo planes had pulled every Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, chasing them, right at the exact moment. 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived overhead with nothing standing between them and the flight decks of 4 Japanese carriers. In about 6 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, Foryu were burning wrecks. Hiryu would follow by nightfall. The most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled by Japan up to that point was gone. Torpedo Squadron 8 had not sunk a single ship, and it may have won the battle anyway, Torpedo Squadron 8 had bought Midway with almost nothing but bodies. That fact did not go unnoticed inside the US Navy, and it forced a hard, unsentimental question. How do you build a torpedo attack that doesn't require sacrificing an entire squadron just to distract the enemy's fighters? The answer arrived in stages, and the Imperial Japanese Navy felt every one of them. The first change was the airplane itself. By late 1942, the lumbering Devastator was being phased out in favor of the Grumman TBF Avenger, faster, better armored, carrying a power turret and a belly-mounted gunner, in addition to the pilot, and able to survive damage that would have shredded a Devastator. The second change was tactical. American commanders began training torpedo squadrons to attack in coordination with dive bombers and fighter escorts, arriving from multiple bearings at once, so that a defending ship couldn't simply turn its guns and its wheel toward a single threat axis. It became known informally as the anvil attack, torpedo planes converging from both bows simultaneously, so that whichever way a captain turned to comb the wakes, he was turning into another set of torpedoes. This is where the fear started to become institutional rather than instinctive. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942, Avengers from USS Enterprise and Hornet helped put multiple torpedo hits into the Japanese carrier Shokaku's escort screen and damaged the carrier Zuiho, forcing Japan's carrier air power out of the fight for months at a time when neither side could easily replace losses. It wasn't a knockout blow, but Japanese damage control officers were now writing reports about a torpedo plane that hit harder, survived longer, and came in formations built specifically to defeat a ship's evasive turns. By 1944, that fear had a name inside Japanese fleet doctrine: the Coordinated American Strike Package. Japanese anti-aircraft gunnery had actually improved significantly by this point in the war. Heavier automatic weapons, better fire control, more guns packed onto every hull. It didn't matter. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American pilots shot down so many inexperienced Japanese aircraft, 1944 replacement pilots simply couldn't match the men lost at Midway and in the Long Solomons campaign, that American aviators nicknamed it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's carrier air arm, the force that had launched Pearl Harbor, never recovered from that single afternoon, which brings us to October 24, 1944, and the Sibuyan Sea. The battleship Musashi, sister ship to the legendary Yamato, was 862 feet of steel, 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever built, and armor plate designed by engineers who believed no bomb or torpedo combination could sink her. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had reportedly predicted, years earlier, that she would ultimately be destroyed not by enemy battleships but by aircraft. On the morning of the 24th, as part of the Japanese fleet's desperate push into Leyte Gulf, Musashi's lookout spotted American planes at 0810 hours. What followed was roughly 7 hours of continuous, wave after wave attack. Helldiver dive bombers softening her anti-aircraft defenses, and Avenger torpedo bombers flying in the coordinated pincer pattern American doctrine had spent 2 years perfecting, putting hit after hit into her hull below the waterline, port and starboard simultaneously, so that no amount of counterflooding could keep her stable. By the time she went down that evening, Musashi had absorbed an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, more ordnance than any warship had taken and sunk in the entire war up to that point. Her commander, Admiral Toshihiro Inoguchi, tried to beach her on a nearby island, but the engines failed before he could. He went down with his ship. Captain Kenkichi Kato, who survived, wrote in his private notebook afterward that he was almost relieved so few other vessels in the fleet had been damaged, while adding that he somehow felt Musashi, as the primary target, had managed to save the rest of the force simply by absorbing everything herself. That sentence says everything about what the Imperial Japanese Navy had learned to fear by late 1944. Not a torpedo plane's speed, not its firepower, which was modest compared to a battleship's own guns. What Japanese commanders feared was the arithmetic, a slow, ugly little airplane that no longer traveled alone, no longer attacked from one direction, and no longer stopped coming until the largest, most heavily armored warship ever built simply ran out of ways to stay afloat. 6 months later, Japan would send Musashi's sister ship, on a mission that everyone involved, including the men who ordered it, already understood was a funeral. April 7, 1945. The East China Sea, roughly 200 miles from Kyushu, Japan, Yamato sailed that morning on what her own officers understood to be a one-way voyage. Operation Tengo called for the battleship, escorted by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, to fight through to Okinawa, beach herself deliberately on the shore, and use her 9/18 1-inch guns as a fixed artillery battery against the American invasion force, buying time with the last great symbol of Japanese naval power. Since Japan no longer had enough fuel, aircraft, or trained pilots to send her with any real air cover at all, she had almost none. The task force's combat air patrol was effectively non-existent by this stage of the war. Everyone aboard, from Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito down to the youngest sailor, understood roughly what that meant. American submarines spotted the task force leaving the Bungo Strait, and reconnaissance aircraft confirmed its course by the following morning. Task Force 58 launched more than 280 aircraft in successive waves: Hellcats and Corsairs, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers, many of the same squadrons, flying the same coordinated attack doctrine that had helped kill Musashi 6 months earlier in the Sibuyan Sea. The first American aircraft made contact with Yamato shortly after Aero 800. The main attack began around 12:30. What followed was, by design, almost a repeat performance of Musashi's death. Dive bombers working over the ship's anti-aircraft batteries and superstructure first, degrading her ability to defend herself, while Avenger squadrons split their approach and came in from both port and starboard simultaneously, so that whichever direction Yamato's captain turned the wheel to comb one spread of torpedo wakes, he was turning the ship's hull directly into another. It worked exactly the way it was designed to work. Torpedo after torpedo struck below the waterline, concentrated disproportionately on Yamato's port side. Whether by coordinated American intent or the accumulated chance of dozens of separate attack runs, the effect was the same. The ship began listing hard to port, faster than her damage control teams could compensate. By early afternoon, counterflooding could no longer keep her stable. At roughly 14:20 hours, Yamato rolled onto her side. Her forward magazine detonated in an explosion so large it was reportedly visible from more than 100 miles away, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris thousands of feet into the sky. He had absorbed at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. Some accounts factoring in near misses and secondary damage put the total higher. Of her roughly 3,332 crew, an estimated 3,055 died, including Admiral Ito. It remains one of the largest single losses of life on any warship in naval history. Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers went down with her. American losses that day: 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. The Imperial Japanese Navy that had opened the war by crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet in 90 minutes at Pearl Harbor. The Navy whose pilots had outflown, outgunned, and outmaneuvered nearly everything the Allies put in front of them for the first 6 months of the war, ended it having lost its 2 largest, most powerful battleships to the exact same weapon, delivered by the exact same tactic, roughly 6 months apart. Not battleship duels, not submarines, though those played their part too. Slow, ugly, unglamorous torpedo planes that Japanese pilots themselves had watched get massacred at Midway less than 3 years earlier, and had underestimated ever since. Operation Tengo was the last time the Imperial Japanese Navy sortied a major surface fleet against the Allies. There was, after April 7, 1945, effectively no major fleet left to sortie. That's the real answer to the question in this video's title. Japan built the finest naval aviators of the early war, the fastest fighters, and the deadliest surface-launched torpedoes anyone had ever fielded. For what they never fully solved, and what cost them their 2 largest battleships within 6 months of each other, was how to defend against a plane too slow to be respected and too coordinated to be stopped. The U.S. Navy didn't beat the Imperial Japanese Navy by outbuilding it, though it eventually did that too. In the specific narrow arithmetic of April 7, 1945, it beat them with 30-year-old tactics born from a squadron of 30 men who never landed a single torpedo 3 years earlier, and whose sacrifice taught every pilot who came after them exactly how to make sure the next attack actually worked. If you want the next real story from this war, not the recycled highlight reel, but the actual paper trail, that's what this channel exists to dig up. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone, and it genuinely shapes what gets covered next.